Larissa Waters.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for coming along today. Hello, Minister. I was likewise very interested in the report that the COAG Reform Council released just this week, and Senator Tillam's asked many of the questions that I had about pay equity. I was interested in your views on what do you think drives the difference that we see in the performance of girls at the end of their school and indeed in graduation rates, and yet the stark figures about workforce participation. In your view, what are the main drivers of that real turnaround?
Well, what we see is at graduate level, a lot of organisations recruiting equally, or almost equally, young men and young women. But as the years go on, we see those numbers decline as far as the women are concerned. And it's probably fair to say that the biggest barriers are cultural barriers. In the first instance, a lot of bias and the circumstances, the structures within workplaces, embedded bias in HR systems and the like. And then there are structural barriers, and the structural barriers include the inability of organisations to mainstream flexible work and put in place provisions for flexible careers. And the other major structural barrier is childcare. And the need for affordable, flexible, accessible childcare is obviously something that will drive better workforce participation, and currently it's a big structural impediment to the workforce participation of women.
Thank you. Now, pardon my ignorance, can you update me on what's being done, if anything, about flexible work hours? What are our current legislative parameters, and have there been any moves to make those a bit more progressive?
Well, I can assist in that regard, because that's under the Fair Work Act. The current legislation has provisions for individual flexibility arrangements. Regrettably, those individual flexibility arrangements have been substantially curtailed in both modern awards and enterprise agreements, and in our policy released 4 months before the election, we indicated that we sought to give full expression as originally intended in the legislation to individual flexibility arrangements, including the extension of the period when you could unilaterally terminate such an arrangement. Under the current legislation, it is 28 days. The Labor Party's own Fair Work Act review panel suggested that 28 days should be extended to 3 months or 90 days, and we adopted that as part of our policy platform before the last election. And one of the reasons we believe it's very important is in the area of childcare. If a parent makes arrangements for childcare with an individual flexibility arrangement, and the boss unilaterally with 28 days notice can say, end of story, good luck to that parent seeking to make new childcare arrangements within 28 days. And so that 3-month period, I think, will provide, from that perspective, better protection to workers that have childcare requirements to assist in their work-life balance.
Thanks, Minister.
And might I just add, the whole individual flexibility arrangement regime under Labor, and would be continued under us, would be subject to a better off overall test. In other words, the worker would have to be better off overall in any individual flexibility arrangement.
Thanks, Minister. I'll do a bit more research around that as well myself. And again, because I'm relatively new to this area, can you assist me by just explaining to me what is the scope of your agency's work?
Well, the agency is focused on efforts that will improve and promote gender equality in Australian workplaces. So under the new legislation, the Workplace Gender Equality Act, we'll receive output data from organisations in the private sector with 100 or more employees around
100 or more?
100 or more, around their gender performance. So the model of the agency is that we're a light touch regulator and our work is underpinned by working collaboratively with employers. So the reporting that employers have to do to the agency will give us that data. We will then look at that data and convert it into benchmarks. So we'll create benchmarks as we're required to do under the legislation in relation to those gender equality indicators.
Enforceable benchmarks?
No, these are benchmarks simply for educational purposes.
Okay.
So the benchmarks will be by organisational size and by industry sector. So organisations will be able to see what their performance is against these gender equality indicators, how they're comparing with their competitors, how they're tracking over time. But most importantly, it will enable them to identify where they have issues and how they can most effectively and efficiently apply the resources they might have available for this area to improve their performance. And similarly, it enables us to effectively and efficiently apply our resources to helping them. Now, many employers are saying to us this is data that they've never had and they would really like to have. So for us, the engine room of the legislation is getting this truly standardised, unique data that nobody else collects, putting it in a form that's very useful for employers and driving change through working collaboratively with employers.
Can I ask what's possibly a silly question? Why?
I always get
No
worried
such
when
thing.
senators say that this might be a silly question. Usually it's a lot better than a silly question.
Thank you. It remains to be seen. I'm interested in the interaction between the Sex Discrimination Act and this new Workplace Act. How is it not against the Sex Discrimination Act to have, well, a gender pay gap for one, but to have these other forms of discrimination in the workforce on the basis of gender?
Well, it is true that under the Sex Discrimination Act, you're not entitled to discriminate on certain grounds in certain areas, including employment. But of course, you have to be able to establish legally that you are being discriminated on a particular basis, discriminated against on a particular basis. The interface between the two agencies really works this way. Our charter is really to work with employers to help them put in place the structures and the systems to improve workplace gender equality. The Sex Discrimination Act really facilitates individual complaints around incidents of alleged discrimination. And of course there are other provisions under that Act that enables the Commissioner to do certain things. So it's a slightly different orientation from us. Our orientation is very focused on employers, working with employers to try and drive change within workplaces as opposed to working with individuals or working in the policy space.
Sounds like both are very much needed. Well, thank you for that. Just on that gender pay gap, again, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm misinformed, is that we've currently got, as you said, a gap of about 17.5%. And my understanding is that this has increased in recent years. It used to be about 15%. If that's the case, do you have any sense of why that is?
Well, it moves, it's reported by ABS on a regular basis, and it does move from period to period. And over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's moved between about 15 and 18%. Sometimes it'll move up a bit, sometimes it moves down a bit, but it generally stays within that band of 15 to 18%. And why is that so? Well, I think the reason for that is that we've been unable to substantively deal with the various factors that are driving this gap. And they are complex and many, and the way to deal with that differs, and there needs to be a collective effort to deal with the different factors to make an impact on the figures.
Okay. Well, look, I want to leave that issue and move to a more specific one. And again, pardon me if I'm underinformed. I understand there's about 1.2 million Australian women who experience domestic or family violence, and obviously this can have implications for their ability to attend and perform in the workplace. Is there anything that's being done to try and extend those workplace discrimination protections to victims of domestic violence?
Well, Senator, much of that is outside my area of responsibility. What I can say is that there are some specific reporting matters that organisations have to report against in the the reporting form they'll give us that involves support for those who are suffering domestic violence. But otherwise, that's outside my area.
Okay. Who would I take that up with, just out of interest?
Well, look, ultimately that's a policy issue, potentially for government, but also potentially for the Fair Work Commission, if submissions are made. But it is one of those fraught areas, and if I may just take a little bit of time, just in case I be misinterpreted, I was on the inaugural committee and honorary legal advisor of a women's shelter in my home state of Tasmania in the local community for about a decade, and I have represented many a victim of domestic violence, and so I trust my volunteer work in that area will be recognised. Before I make this observation, that if extra paid leave or entitlements are to be given to these victims, it will mean that the business, often the small business, will have to pay for the consequences of the perpetrator. And often, you know, if somebody, and this is very realistic, might have to take a week off work, for example, because of domestic violence, well, a small business then has to, if they are to be paid during that time off work, have to find a replacement worker, and if it's a small business, that all comes out of the family budget at the end of the week for the mum and dad running that small business, and the perpetrator of the violence doesn't have to pay for those consequences. So we just have to be, I think, very careful as we go down that road to make sure that there aren't unforeseen consequences that could be highly prejudicial, especially to small businesses. But that's just one thing I would ask be taken into account. But having said that, you know, my heart goes out to victims of domestic violence. It is horrendous and should be abhorred by everybody.
On that point, Minister, are there any protections for dismissal of workers suffering domestic violence if they've not, or indeed Ms Conway, if they've not been able to attend work for, you know, in the normal manner, as opposed to your issues about payment, which I will do more research on before I make any comment about?
One would imagine, and I stand to be corrected, and possibly these questions might be better when the department comes on later this evening to give advice as to that, but I dare say one's medical or sick leave, medical certificates, etc., would carry you for a period in any event, but how much further that goes, I confess I'm not sure.
All right, thank you. I'll take that up at the appropriate time. And if I could just have one final issue, Chair. The question of quota for women on boards has been raised already, and obviously the Business Council have recently made perhaps an unexpected and very welcome suggestion in that regard. I'm interested in what the policy rationale is for not having one. Why do we not already have one, given that we have quite a few countries that indeed have that with successful effect? Does the agency consider that within your scope?
Well, that's more a policy decision for government, and in the past it has not occurred, and it'd be fair to say this government would not be minded to adopt a quota system. Believes in equality of opportunity, and that has to be pursued, but equality of outcome, if I might say, often demeans and demeans the currency of what should be a genuine merit selection process. So we would say equality of opportunity, but not necessarily forcing an equality of outcome where you mightn't be getting as good a outcome as otherwise.
And again, we come back to those structural deterrents, which in fact influence your logic.
And
your logic there.
Yeah, and so rather than forcing an equality, in inverted commas, those structural issues need to be addressed to ensure that you then get the desired outcome.
Well, I look forward to the new government addressing those, and I might
Oh,
add
look,
that I think this is the
and
only
if I
time that
might
the
say,
government
the
hasn't
new-
taken the advice of the Business Council of Australia, which is sad in this instance that you're not following their lead.
Oh, well, we
that's
don't
my
always
final
follow
question.
them,
Thank you, Chair.
but if I might say, the paid parental leave scheme that we as a government have championed in fact deals with some of those very structural issues of which you speak, where we can achieve the outcomes without the imposition of artificial quotas.
Thanks, Minister.
Thank you. I have a couple